I would propose, because we are a little bit late, to postpone the discussion on this presentation to the general panel discussion. The panel discussion is taken over by Robert double day, 2 days, so no, but we don't have so much time. So could we please ask all the speakers to show up at the stage, and also the chairwoman and the chairman, and I would like to pass over to you, or you organize the process.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So if the speakers would come up, Stephen, great, thanks. And I think you will have, if you share this among you. Great, well, thank you everybody. I'm sure you'll agree that's an absolutely fascinating morning session. And one thing I promise that I'll do is finish at 1 o'clock, so we've got 35 minutes. And I think because there's such stimulating presentations from the speakers, I'm sure that many of you will want to grab the speakers immediately after we finish here to continue the conversation, and I'm sure that's fine with most of the speakers here. So please do that. But there is some time for some general discussion, and I think we should be grateful to EFSA for putting this on the agenda, open risk assessment. Of course, openness is nothing new in science. As we know from historians of science, in the 17th century, it's openness and conducting science in public that led to the scientific revolution of the late 17th century. And EFSA itself, people have pointed out, operates a form of crowdsourcing in terms of relying on expertise beyond its own institution. So the challenges we've been talking about are not, in some sense, anything new, but the scale and scope of it is new. The scale, as we've heard about in terms of the kinds of data that's out there, the kinds of demands to participate in the process, that the scales are new. And also, rather than thinking about opening up and participation at the end of the pipe in the communication of risk, this is about bringing it right to the very beginning, right to the heart of the process, so that we're thinking about risk governance as a whole and thinking about open assessment right at the heart of this. And we've heard some of the reasons. There's political demands, stakeholders, publics, consumers demand a voice in these kinds of processes. The rigor, when we're talking about such complex processes, we know that no single form of expertise is ever going to encompass everything. So rigor requires an openness. The data, as we heard about, the absolute escalating volumes of data require new ways of approaching assessment and analysis. And efficiency, because we know the world is getting more complex, the data is increasing at exponential rates, and yet public resources aren't growing at the same rate as the complexity in the data. So we need to be more efficient in how we think about these things. So huge challenges, great opportunities. The keynote gave us some really helpful conceptual guiding lights to think about where to look. So where to look in terms of how to think of the publics and experts in terms of the skills and instruments they can bring to the process. So let's look at the assets. How can we make the most of them? And then we had, through the discussion of crowdsourcing and the use of artificial intelligence, what did you call it? Cognitive computing, thank you. Some hints at ways that we might be making progress. But I think I was very struck by the point that in these experimenting with these processes, we need to think about the resources. I'm going to use your 3 Rs, or a version of your 3 Rs, the kinds of resources it takes. It takes time and energy and effort to think about, and this is from both Stephen and as well, the time that needs to be put into framing the challenge. What are we trying to achieve? Put time into that, and capacity to rework that through the crowdsourcing process. And recognizing that different people, again, to be involved in this and will require recognition and rewards that's appropriate to what motivates their willingness to take part in this. So we can't just assume that we know why people want to be involved. So big challenges, some suggestions of how we're going to take it forward. Now I want to open up to the floor for questions, but maybe it can be open. But let's go for one. I'm particularly interested in starting the conversation around crowdsourcing and where you've had experience of that in relation to risk assessment, where you might have particular questions you want to put. But we'll be fairly open about this.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is John O'Brien. I work for Nestlé Research. I want to thank, first of all, the panel. I think the presentations were fantastic, very interesting, very thought-provoking. I have two questions, both around the topic of integrity of the outcome and integrity of the process. Now, the first question is more or less, I guess, directed to Professor De Vries and Stephen Drew. Individually, I wouldn't feel comfortable as a solver working for an unknown seeker. So my question is about transparency. Is the process credible if you have a 70% anonymity level? So that's question number one. Second question is quite short, again around integrity and governance. When we employ important processes in society, we tend to like to standardize those so that we get consistent performance and consistent results. And I'm asking questions about who's responsible, who's accountable when you have a large, I guess let's call it a black box. That's being provocative, but let's call it a black box. Who takes responsibility on the final result? And to add to that, I guess the point is, how can you tell when you have a good crowd or a bad crowd? Again, a provocative question. What if you have different crowds getting different answers?
Thank you.
How do you defend that? So sorry for the long
it's
question.
good. I mean, two excellent, or at least two excellent questions. Stephen, can I turn to you first to pick up the question of integrity as it was put there?
Yes. So the question about anonymity and the 70% figure that was up there. I put my hand up there. I've clearly presented that in a way that wasn't easy to understand. What I meant by 70% anonymity is Innocentive has run something like 2,000 plus challenges externally, where we're running challenges on behalf of our clients. On 70% of those occasions, the challenges have been run 100% anonymously. And 30% of the challenges are different, where our client has wanted to brand their association with the challenge. So in other words, they're putting their organization or company name up there when they post the challenge. So sorry for the confusion there, but just to clarify, when it's anonymous, it's anonymous.
Did you want to talk about the sort of quality, the sort of set of questions about the quality from crowdsourcing?
Yes, I can comment on this. What if you have a bad crowd? Of course, that is a problem if you don't have anyone who actually understands the question you are trying to answer. But the same applies to bad experts. So what do we do if we have a bad expert? Well, probably we get a lousy assessment. So this is not a new problem. And I would say that if the processes are open and invite a lot of people, we will early on see if the process is led by poor analysts or poor judgment. So, yeah.
Thank you. Gerd, do you want to wrap up this round of responses?
Well, as to crowdsourcing, I think it would be helpful to differentiate between problems of a different nature. When I'm looking for a document that I've lost, I may distribute a task and say, okay, one of my kids looks into one room and the other in the bedroom, and the other may be in my study to look for the document, so you can distribute the task. But if you want to solve a puzzle together, it's no use to distribute the pieces of the puzzle among the kids. They have to work together, and they have to do it in a way in which they can adjust each other in terms of one of each of the kids can contribute a piece, and then they may say, okay, well, that fits in another kind. A third kind of problem is when it turns out that the kids have mixed up 2 boxes of jigsaw puzzles and you don't know what kind of puzzle they are actually having to solve. So crowdsourcing, I think, is it would be helpful if we think about it in terms of what kind of problems might be advanced by what kind of, how much do you want to distribute the contributions? Do they need to adjust each other, and so on and so forth? A second comment, perhaps on integrity. Again, well, we tend to think about integrity in terms of a property. So I am integer. Again, to check for the integrity is a matter of relationships. And I do think that here too, there is no easy answer. The point is that you have to organize in one way or another a common cooperation between parties who have different skills and different instruments. It's not different from, say, building a house where you will have an electrician and a plumber and a painter and so on, and each will contribute in each other, and it's no competition between the different parties, but they have to cooperate in a way in which each can see what the other is doing.
Thank you. There's 3 people lining up to ask a question. And I'll give priority to anybody else who wants to come in specifically on crowdsourcing. Yes, are you specifically on crowdsourcing? Okay, so please. And we might take a couple and then go back.
Hi, I'm a journalist for the trade publication NutriIngredients, and stand up. Hi, and with your various models for crowdsourcing, is that kind of employing a all scientists are created equal kind of model, or is there some kind of distinction between experts, which might be more expert? And then on a second point, how do you actually check that people are qualified in the way that they say they are qualified, and the experience they've had in terms of jobs and things like that, and qualifications in particular? How do you vet that?
Thank you. And shall we take a second question here? And you want crowdsourcing or not? Yeah, okay. So we'll take a second question and a third question on crowdsourcing.
Hello, I'm also a journalist, Kate Trollope from EU Food Policy. In English, when you say the word crowdsourcing and you don't really know what it is, you think of a big crowd of lots of people. But it strikes me that for EFSA's purposes, it might be a more useful tool to be much more targeted and sometimes have, a wide participation but fewer people, because EFSA, its main issues with some of its stakeholders are not necessarily the man or woman in the street, the general public. So I'd just like a little bit more expertise from you on how crowdsourcing works in that particular situation. Thank you.
And then a third and final in this round on crowdsourcing.
It's Barbara Glani from the Food and Drink Federation in the UK. And I was quite surprised about the enormous reliance on trust on the platform for information gathering. And on the knowledge crystals, I kept thinking knowledge crystal equals silver bullet, and trying to think, can that tool really address all the questions from scientific knowledge sharing to media information? So the panel's view would be interesting.
Thank you. I'm now going to be really mean and ask the panel to be quite brief. I think that these are big, big questions that we're not going to answer now, but there's questions about, who is the crowd? Is everyone equal in the crowd? Who decides whose voice counts? Questions about, as you were raising around trust, but also then about, how it addresses the various stakeholder kind of interests. These are big things. But does anybody want to start with some just quick responses to that? Well, Stephen, and then we'll come down this way.
Okay, so the first question, are all scientists equal? Let me just say, they don't have to be scientists, it's people. what we're looking for in most scenarios is a solution. It actually doesn't really matter where that solution comes from. We're just looking for the best solution. Now, of course, we can run challenges in many different ways. We can run challenges where you can combine the ideas. You can run challenges where it's a written proposal. You can run challenges where it's a proposal that you can then bring in-house and test. There's an evaluation stage to validate the credibility. So it's not really a single thing. Luckily, there are many ways in which we can position, and there are many ways in which we can run the challenges with different ways of running that process to achieve the deliverable that you're seeking. The goal is the solution. That's the key. It doesn't really matter where it comes from.
Thank you. Yes, you want to start?
Thank you for the important questions. Just a few points about who is qualified to participate. This is also related to the previous question about good crowd and bad crowd. For me and many of the firms with whom we have collaborated around crowdsourcing seem to think that this is not an issue to be determined beforehand. In the age of open collaboration and open knowledge creation and sharing, you have to be open also for the crowd and its capability. So this is something that truly, you can truly answer that question whether the crowd is good or bad only by trying, only by doing something with that crowd and letting it to demonstrate its potential. This seems to be the most fruitful approach. It can be unsuccessful. You may get bad solutions, bad ideas, but you may also succeed. And another point here is what crowdsourcing researchers have long known, that indeed the quality of ideas and knowledge input you get from the large crowd, it is indeed of high quality. For instance, in one research which was related to product development and new product development ideas, when the input from the crowd was evaluated, it was on blind anonymous evaluation, even the industry experts themselves rated the ideas from the crowd better than their own. So this is a message for any industry and any type of organization to consider.
Okay, I had a comment on qualification, but actually the other panelists already said what I was going to say, so no more about that. Whether knowledge crystals are silver bullets or not, we don't know, but that's a hypothesis that I'm kind of putting out for a test. Well, personally I have used this kind of information objects since 2007, and I have been able to do all my work using that kind of approach. So it is possible to do all work like this, at least the kind of science I am doing. Whether it's cost effective, we don't really know, but I think the capacity to summarize information in useful pieces, it's quite good, at least based on my experience, so we should try out in a larger scale to see whether it is a silver bullet or not.
Thank you. We can come back to other members of the panel in the next round, but I do want to get some more questions in. There's two I have over here, one here and then one at the very back, and then one here.
Yeah, this is a question more to Dr. Brooks, but I think it's tangential to what we've been discussing. Who feeds what's on the data? Because I'm in the GMO EFSA panel, and we receive a lot of garbage from big companies. And I think of the concept of GIGO. Garbage. No, seriously. So it's really hard to evaluate garbage. So if you feed garbage, if you feed what's on garbage, you know, it's a GIGO concept. Who decides what Watson should evaluate? Does it scan the whole universe and so forth?
Great question. Thank you. Yes, it might as well come forward and then to the back. So, yeah, do you want to do you stand up? Yeah. And then immediately the third question right at the back after this. Yeah, thank you.
I've got a question that is directed to Dr. Lohmann. So it has nothing to do with crowdsourcing. It's okay to take it? I'm Leif Busk from the National Food Agency in Sweden. And you have the assessment, and then you have the risk profile. The link between, is it written down in the procedures, how you do the risk assessment, that makes you end up with these risk profile, or is it an interpretation by someone else? And second thing, the severity of the effect that you have assessed, how do you take that into account in the profile? Thank you.
Thank you. And then finally, a question at the very back, if you can be quick with the microphone. Yep, at the very back. And then we'll come to you next round. Yeah, and if you could introduce yourself, please, as well.
Hello, I'm Mai, and I'm just a student from the Berlin School for Economic and Law, and I have a question addressed to Andrew, to Mr. Drew. So I can imagine that the platform like an incentive can be used for developing such a risk profile like the BFR has introduced to us, but do they also have relevance for microbiological or chemical risk assessment, and how can you encourage such governmental risk assessment institutions to use such platform? Because as we can see that they have to pay a lot for the idea.
So do you think that it's possible or not? What's your view?
I don't think that it's possible.
Okay, good. A good skeptical question. Thank you. So, Cameron, do you want to start with this very good question?
Garbage in, garbage out, right? So I guess the way I'd answer that is it depends what question you're asking of Watson, what you're trying to have Watson answer. If you're trying to get a general feel from the crowd on GMO, what you may want to do is target it more generally, and perhaps some of what you'll get is garbage, but you may want to use a tool to analyze the tone of social media, Twitter, other open sources of data, and that's the kind of question you might not be asking for something very specific, in which case all the garbage would be relevant, but just more a general tone and connections to what people are saying. If you're looking for more of a scientific tool, like the examples I gave, more of a discovery process, you're not going to target Watson at that kind of garbage. You're going to tie it at more trusted sources, medical journals, scientific articles that Watson can ingest and read, and then become like that scientific colleague, that expert in the room. So even in the process of doing that, you can weigh sources differently as part of the ingestion process. So you can, if you have a trusted source, you'll weigh that at 0.9, 0.8. If you have a source that in the past has given some valuable tidbits, but perhaps not always on the level, you'll weigh that 0.3, 0.4, and then you do the ingestion, and then you kind of see what comes out. And then as you do the learning, you can also start to teach Watson the answers, and it'll start to then on its own to figure out which sources that came from.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to respond?
Concerning the risk profile, so of course there exist standard operating procedures for the risk assessment, and also for risk communication there exist guidelines for good practice in risk communication. For example, always to use one dimension or unit, not to say in one case it's a microgram or milligram. Not everyone is able to convert it. It's not necessary to do it. And also not to compare imposed risk with risk which are voluntary. And so there exist some guidelines. And concerning the risk profile, there exists a document where all the terminologies are defined. So, for example, the probability of a health impairment, what does it mean? Is it possible or impossible? So you have to fix it in a document that every risk assessor is able to highlight the same category based on these specified rules. This is absolutely important. So the risk profile cannot stand alone. It should read also in conjunction with the opinion. And you must have this document behind it to understand what is really meant by the probability, for example. That's the biggest issue. Maybe to say it is impossible because no effects in animals were observed, no human data exists, but it is theoretical possible. There's a theoretical assumption. Then you can highlight maybe possible. But you need an explanation for every category. And this risk profile is, let's say, a profile for the consumer, especially for the consumer, for the risk manager to see at the first glance how to react. Is it a risk with a high risk potential or with a low one? To give priority in their decision-making process. But it's really a tool thought to be developed for the consumer to have an overview about controllability measurements and to be specified. This is normally not the case for risk assessors. They want to have these several categories and want to add more information, but this is the only way here to be specified for the risk assessment, to say this is possible, not, or this is a risk where there's high uncertainty.
Thank you. Does that answer your question? Yeah, great. Stephen, could I ask you to be brief?
I'll be brief. Yes, so when it comes to any problem really, there's always a value in solving the problem. And it's absolutely fair to say that a challenge would be used where there's a real reason why that problem wants to be solved, and there's probably a pretty reasonable value for achieving that. Most awards for challenges are in the range $10,000 to $25,000, which is roughly equivalent in euro these days. And I suppose maybe having 50 to 100 proposals, so 50 to 100 options to consider, that's a pretty good return. I wonder what the cost would be to have 50 to 100 internal teams working in the same way, coming up with that variety of different proposals. Okay, so the cost return can actually be staggering. It can be. It's not always, but it can be.
Excellent. Thank you. So what I'm going to do now is take a final round. So this is your last chance for questions or comments or kind of completely random statements you want to make. And I know we've got one from our rapporteurs as well. And then I'll turn to the panel and give everybody a chance to either respond to one of the questions or give a sort of concluding statement. Again, I'm going to ask the panel to be brief when I do that. So I know there was one question right at the back. Oh, okay, so you start with the gentleman here and then go right to the back. And again, if you could introduce yourself.
Mikola Grala from Warsaw University of Life Sciences. I was thinking about the risk, and I have the feeling they understand the risk. So 1% risk, let's say it's negligible risk or no risk at all. But I am also thinking about the growing population of hypochondriacs. If somebody will read that for the consumer, some product have the 1% risk, and BFR is going to present it to everybody, I would like to ask, what is the risk that the hypochondriacs stop eating at all?
Thank you. A question at the back? Oh, yeah. And then, excuse me, a final question from the floor here. Yeah.
So I have, sorry, my name's Keith O'Neill. I'm with Abbott Nutrition. And I guess I have a pretty general question, but I mean, if I summarize what I take away from the content of the presentation, we have access now to increasingly sophisticated tools and systems to bring more and more brain power, whether that's human brain power or cognitive computing brain power, to tackle this sort of increasingly complex data environment that we're in. We know that when we set a group of humans to assess this kind of information, different groups of humans assess the same information, come up with different answers. So I suppose my question for the panel is, to what extent these tools are likely to bring greater global harmonization to these kinds of assessments? So do we have EFSA and similar regulatory bodies coming up with the same answers around the world?
Thank you.
Thank you. I think the previous speaker, Ángela Rodríguez Peña, I'm a biomedical scientist, but I think my question is related as a citizen. And you actually pointed out my question. In a global world, how long these regulatory agencies can work together and have a common answers where you are not actually tied up for your own constituencies. So you are not talking only about Europe or North States of America, but also other parts of the world. So it was very much related to how regulatory agencies and economical powers can be actually shown up clearly and to see who wins and who loses.
Thank you. Thank you. And finally, a question here.
Thank you very much. I'm Didier Velo, I'm from EFSA, but I have questions from Twitter. So the first one is for Professor Ober. So is there a role for the citizen or the crowd in the socio-economic analysis phase of the REACH process? And then the second one is then specific for Cameron Brooks. So who owns a specific corpus after the training? So who is the owner of the corpus? Does it become open or is it available for everybody? So who is the owner of the corpus? Thank you.
Thank you. So that's two quite nicely specific questions. And then we had three very broad questions, which are obviously much broader than just alternative approaches to open risk assessment, but whether one's thinking about how different people will interpret risks, how risk management and governance will be harmonized or not, and the politics of how these decisions then relate to winners and losers. I mean, these are big, big questions, which you can ignore or respond to as you wish. Shall we start here and then work down and end here? And again, if you could address, use this as closing comments as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think just from my point of view, it's absolutely the case when you're faced with various projects. Let's just call them projects. There are alternative ways in which you can choose to approach those projects. Luckily, today there are increasing ways you can use, which can be very diverse. And so it's important to consider that full range. Remember what I said about the move towards crowd labor. Many things in our society are being served in different ways, both at a personal level and at a business level. So just remember that, and as business and authorities, take advantage of it when you can. Don't get too stuck in the way things have always been done.
Great.
And try and break down some of those internal barriers which do sometimes exist. We can use evidence of examples to prove that some of those fears really aren't there.
Thank you.
Okay, concerning the different interpretation of the risk, so it has something to do with risk perception. And there exist several types of society, and a very common type shows, for example, a high tolerance toward leisure risk. So free climbing, for example, is not a problem, but they are strong against imposed risks, for example, nuclear power station or mobile phone. And to address these target groups, it's quite easy, but there are very extreme groups. So groups, they see in every topic a risk. They see a risk for every new technology and food product. And the other group, they do not consider any risk topic, so they can be hardly reached in case of a crisis. They do not change their behavior. And so these two extreme groups are quite neglected in risk communication. You have no chance to address them specifically. There exist no tools for that.
Thank you.
But you have to address it to the common type.
Excellent, thank you.
We heard a lot of exciting new developments in tools. Some of these tools, I think, are just stretching the existing practices. But some other tools, I guess, will require rethinking some of the received wisdom we have about risk assessment and risk management and the relation between the two. To use just an example of Stephen, so if you look at Facebook and Uber and so on, all those developments are new and they present all kinds of questions about responsibility, about decision making and so on, and I have no doubt that this will happen also if you include the new developments that we have heard about into the risk assessment and management practice.
Thank you.
So I guess I'll address the question that was specific to me first, the who owns the corpus of information. The quick answer to that is if a client is paying us to ingest information into Watson, then they own that corpus of information. So we were, unless told otherwise or incented otherwise, we're not going to take a Watson corpus for one client and share it with another client. Obviously, there are opportunities in doing that, and that actually brings me to kind of the other question around different food safety agencies and can they collaborate and consolidate. And so maybe one option is because there is even more data spread out across the world in this area. So you've got perhaps one corpus that's got food safety information from a variety of different sources, and then could be helping making decisions based on a more diverse, perhaps previously siloed set of information. So unless left by its own devices, each Watson corpus will stand by itself.
Great.
But there's obviously opportunities to collaborate.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So my final remark is about this global harmonization, which was asked by two people here. I don't think that these methods that we're now talking about will harmonize everything in the world, because what we are talking about is decision support. So we are providing knowledge for decision makers, and decision makers are different in different countries. The cultures are different, people want different things, so the decisions will stay different in different parts of the world. However, I hope that this kind of information tools and knowledge producers are able to provide better information and better knowledge to decision makers, so that the bad ideas are no longer implemented, so that decision makers will get what they want, not what they think they want.
Thank you.
My final remark is a general one. The best way to understand change, which is taking place nowadays, is to take part in it. When you want to understand crowdsourcing, you want to understand open knowledge collaboration with different stakeholders and engage in interaction with them. Just to do some experiments, learn by doing, because that's the way all the best leading firms and organizations have started. Taking small steps. You don't have to launch a $10,000 campaign in a big platform and to engage a crowd of 15,000 people. You can start small and learn about your results and insights. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I can play a little bit devil's advocate now at the end. Crowdsourcing, actually we use it already in our public consultations with finding alternatives to substances of very high concern, where we really try to direct the consultation in coming up with alternatives. And the reward that is there is, of course, if you're a supplier, then you can get economic reward. Maybe we would get more answers if we had been paying in some other way. But on the other hand, I mean, this euphoria about big data, it's difficult for me to share that. What I confront every day is the lack of data, or the lack, I should say, lack of information. That I can't find meaningful dose-response relationships, for example, for the most studied controversial chemical on the scene now, bisphenol A. It's not that we have an enormous lot of studies, data, but we can't establish meaningful dose-response relationship for health impact assessment. And it's actually the same also where we come to getting economic data about cost, social welfare cost. So actually primary information is of very big need. On the other hand, it of course sounds very thrilling to maybe have Watson on my panel as a co-opted member. Could introduce consistency in our opinions. And so of course we should try to take tools into operation as quickly as we can. But I think still that there is plenty of room for the human expert that can make the assessment and also help to train Watson other intelligent software. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I know that there are many questions, specific and general, that have gone unaddressed, but please do catch up with the speakers in the break. I think it's been quite an inspiring morning. I think that we've heard that these challenges are here and they can't be ducked. That what we're talking about is augmenting, not replacing existing approaches. And you've heard many exciting options that are out there, and there are many not in the room as well. I think wise words to sort of get stuck in, to start small and experiment and learn. And, you know, who knows, Garrett might be right. It might, you know, require rethinking and being quite creative and reflect and thoughtful about the process in doing so. But really all we should do now is thank EFSA very much for hosting this morning's discussion, and thank the panelists and my co-chairs for the time and energy they put into the discussion. So thank you.